You come to me when I'm lonely. I take your hand and we go home. Hello, Rhonda. Thank you for joining us at the fire.
Hi, Sasha, and I'm excited to be here around the fire.
I am so excited to be talking to you. So I always begin by asking guests, did you grow up in a family or a household that believed in ghosts or spirits? And or did you guys in your family have a tradition of telling ghost stories?
That is a fabulous question, and I have spent some time thinking about it. First, we didn't have the traditional ghost storytelling, but we did have a family where, let's say, the otherworldly was very prominent. We discussed it all the time, whether it was I'm going to go there and say, well, my brother was well into Egyptian pantheon. So we spoke about Egypt and the pharaohs. And I was way into Greek mythology. So we spoke about the gods and goddesses. And we spoke about things like fairies. And yes, we did speak about ghosts. So all of that was part of the world I grew up in to the point where, and I love storytelling. So, yay, we're talking about stories. One of my childhood memories is having my mother read stories to me as a kid, and one of the authors was Edgar Allan Poe. So scary stories were my bedtime stories. Yeah,
So isn't it interesting? And I have the same thing too. Creepy stories make me feel incredibly cozy. Is that true for you as
yes,
well?
exactly so. I
And
don't feel terrified by the majority of them. There are some that really do get under my skin, and I'm like, "Okay, that one really felt creepy." But usually they're the cozy stories I like to hear when it's getting dark outside or we're in this time of the year where it's dark early and I can snuggle up with a book or listen to a podcast or listen or, that for me is cozy.
that's amazing. So would she read just to you or was she reading bedtime stories to you and your brother together?
To me and my brother. Yes, I have a brother. He's a year and a half older than I am, and since we were close enough in age, we often did a lot of things together. And yeah, she would read stories. I have a vivid memory of being maybe around 5 and standing in the kitchen with my brother, Richard, and saying to my mom, "Read us the story about the bells." And that's Edgar Allan Poe's story about the bells. And she would get very animated and go into I remember that very well. Yeah, it's good stuff.
It's incredible. So then what scared you when you were a child? What freaked you out? What were you afraid of the dark or did you embrace it?
I actually was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of the dark. I had that and I guess it's a pretty common fear that something would come out of the corners or something would come out of the closet. And I remember my dad, who worked outside of the town we lived in, so he traveled a lot. And I remember him coming home once, and I was complaining about not wanting to go to bed because it was going to be dark. And he said, "Listen, we'll put the radio on. You'll have all these people in the room with you." And I would fall asleep to the radio because I was afraid of the dark for a very long time. Now, of course, I prefer the dark, but when I was really young, I did not like that.
And that is something like I think it's an interesting self-preservation technique for small children and even for adults that if you can have something else to put your attention on, a radio show, the music or something, then you're not putting your attention on what's under the bed or what might be behind the shower curtain creeping towards you down the hall.
Exactly, exactly. And, I'm thinking about it. I can't recall ever having that feeling that when I was really, really young, not as I got older, but when I was really, really young, I never had that feeling that something was next to me. So I don't know why I was afraid of the dark. I don't know why. There was nothing that happened that in that initiated, if you will, that feeling of, "No, I don't wanna be here by myself in the dark." I can't think of anything. Later on, yes, but not when I was a little kid.
So wait, so tell me about later on. So it was later in your life that you started to discover.
It was later in my life where I could sense that I was not by myself. And those feelings were unnerving at first, where I would be in a room, and I could be in a room with other people and sense that there was someone near me who wasn't physically standing near me. And that was uncomfortable at first. And not something I was truly, as a kid, you're trying to ignore it. And I would truly try to ignore it. Or, constantly looking over my shoulder, who's there, and there's no one there.
Did you ever figure out who it was that you were was sharing space with you, or was that something that you learned to work with as you matured?
As a little kid, as a younger kid, so we're talking the tween years, those years, I actually chose not to dive into it. Really, I because it was I didn't know how to address it, and I wasn't speaking up. I wasn't saying to my mother or my brothers or anybody, "Hey, are you dealing with this?" I would speak to my grandfather sometimes, and I would tell him that I would have those feelings, and he would just, kind of poo-poo it, but then he would go into his storytelling and tell me stories about, oh, when he was younger and the things he had to deal with to try to drag me away from thinking about it. He would change the topic a bit, but he was the only one I ever really mentioned it to, but that was because we spent a lot of time storytelling. I was constantly asking him to tell me stories, and so I felt comfortable sharing with him my own stories, but he didn't really take them seriously.
Do you now do you now have an inclination of what or who that was with you?
It's really They were primarily just the spaces I was in. If I was in a space, it wasn't generally in my own home. If I was somewhere else, I would you I would sometimes feel that like there was somebody next to me or there was a presence nearby. And often it would be like if I'm visiting old relatives and I'm in their old house or something like that. Those were usually the spaces outside of my own home. In my own home, I never really had that feeling. Um, and Yeah, sometimes it was really just a sense of somebody trying to get my attention, and I kept ignoring them. I didn't want to engage. I did not want to engage. It was not comfortable.
It sounds like being like dancing in a club, and like like somebody's dancing up on you, like trying to like get
Yeah,
with you. Like, no, I'm dancing away.
that's exactly right. I'm over here not paying attention to you at all. Exactly right. Yep.
Did there ever come a time in your life when you were actively engaged with speaking to energies on the other side?
Y Yes, and that came much later. Yeah, I would probably say the first time seriously was with other people. Yes, we were using a spirit board. You're a teenager, this kinda happens. And it wasn't, I thought, "Okay, I'm going to be brave now. I'm going to use this spirit board, and I'm going to see if I can really connect with those people or spirit or whatever that I've been sensing, throughout the years. Can I really speak to them? Can I really connect?" And I wasn't by myself. So I felt a little bit more comfortable trying to do this. And I can be honest, nothing happened in that episode. But what it did allow for me to actually now start talking to other people about it and say, "Hey, have you ever had this experience? Have you ever felt that?" And now I was beginning to get to that place where I felt open enough to say it and not feel like people are going to look at me sideways and say, "Wow, there's something really wrong with you."
How old were you when you started working with your first deck of tarot cards?
Oh, man. I was 12. I was 12 when I got my first deck. And again, no idea what I was doing. I loved I saw and I know it had to be the wolf man. I saw the woman in the caravan reading cards or doing some form of divination, but I thought and I haven't seen the movie in years, but I remember it being cards. She was working with cards, and I thought, "That's what I wanna do. I want to be able to do what she's doing." And so I saved my little allowance money and I bought a deck of cards. It turned out to be Lenormand, so it wasn't actually tarot, but I did start working with them and I tried working with them. And then I finally got my first tarot deck when I was in my late teens. So that was my real dive into it. And that was, still not knowing what I was doing, but I was embracing the fullness of trying to work with divination, and yeah, that opened the pathway for me.
So when you're actively engaged in divination, who is it that how does it work for you or how does it feel for you? And I know that language can often fail us when we're talking about working with invisible energies, working with spirit, working with divinity, or just even working with our own creativity, whatever conversation that is. But what does it feel like for you when you're really keyed into a great reading? Can you
Oh,
walk us through
wow.
what it feels like?
Yes. The a couple of things that happen. The first thing, and it happens naturally at this point, where I can feel myself sinking into my chair, like I'm really getting quiet and still.
Mm.
And even my breathing will start to slow down because I'm really relaxing into the moment. And I'm trying to um, allow myself to be open to the messages. And I know that sounds a little trite and overplayed, but I'm trying to stay open to the messages that come through. And for me, they are the most common way messages come through for me are in flashes of images. So I'll see a thing. Occasionally, I'll have a prominent word that will fly in, like, you know, um, it could be anything, shoe, key, it can be anything. A word will come in occasionally, but usually it's an
Mm.
image that comes through. So when I'm really keyed in, and often, and I say this to my sitters a lot, is you'll often see me with my eyes closed because I'm trying not to I want to stay connected enough to have a coherent conversation with you, but I'm also paying attention to the flashes, the pictures that I'm seeing. And I want to see those images as opposed to your face because I'm trying to get the message. And that's the challenge is sometimes I'll throw a card and you tell me if this happens to you because I'm curious also. I'll throw the cards down. The spread is in front of me. Boom, the message comes through as an image. And now I have to decipher the image and put it back into words to make a coherent message. That's challenging sometimes be- because it's the whole story is in a flash. Boom, I understand the story. Now I have to decipher it and put it into language and deliver the message. That's how it works for me.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, it seems to me that kind of vast chasm of experiencing something like a nighttime dream, and then when you
Mhm.
try and explain the dream to someone, and there's no way you can do it justice. There's no way to
Yes.
capture the richness, the dimension, the feelings, the
Yes.
the multi-dimensionality of depth of our
Yes.
nighttime dreams. And then you have to like tell a story about it, and it seems just so flimsy.
Yes.
Um,
That is
so
so
it's
well said.
yeah, yeah. And it's an interesting thing. I always talk about tarot being storytelling, right? It's
Yeah.
what's the narrative of the cards. And I think that people come to psychics and readers because they want to hear the story of themselves.
Yes.
Do you know? They want to hear
Yes.
someone else tell their story. I've often felt in the past as if I wish I could give the person that I'm reading for the feelings that I'm feeling.
Ching, that is so true. And
Yeah,
it's so elusive. You can't yes, the feeling, if they could feel what you're feeling when you understand the message in the cards, that is and you try to convey that in language, and yes, it's elusive. It can be elusive.
it's yeah, it's I think it's do you feel like can you be as good of a reader for yourself as you are for other people, or is it much different when you're sitting alone with the cards?
It Yeah, that's much different. That is there I mean, of course, we all know the story. We know our own story. We all understand that. So it becomes the challenge of trying to make certain that I am not consciously telling the story that I want to tell myself versus what's coming through in the cards and trying to be that what's the word? I don't want to say dispassionate, but I have to have that level of separation. So I do work with the cards for myself. I do read for myself and work with the cards for, whatever intention setting, what have you. I do work with the cards for those in those ways. But if I have issue, if I will s I need to I will sit with readers and say, "I need you to tell me what you're seeing," because they're receiving messages from their guides, guardians, angels, whomever, ancestors, and those messages will be different from what I'm getting, and that's important for me, I can't just hear it becomes something of an echo chamber when I read for myself, and I need other perspective, absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed, agreed. So do you have, could you describe maybe the most harrowing supernatural experience that you have ever had?
Wow, yes. Yeah, and this was some years back. This is when my both of my kids were starting their freshman year of university, so they're out of the house, and I'm in this old Victorian duplex in the middle of town, very close to an area, very close to a university where they already have their own storied ghost stories. I mean, they already have this famous murder and all this. So I was 2 doors down from that place. And anyway, I lived in this old Victorian, and I'm there by myself. Um, I'd been in the duplex, maybe it was a beautiful home. I loved it, 3 stories, and I'd been there for about a year at this point, and I'm by myself. It has a very long staircase from the main floor up to the floor where the bedrooms are. And I knew, and the only light switch was on the second floor. So if you wanted the hallway lights on upstairs, you had to get up there before it was dark, ideally, turn the lights on, and then you can go back downstairs, do your thing. Because once darkness fell, it was a long, dark stretch up the stairs. So anyway, I had come home from work. I had gone upstairs, put changed out of my work clothes, left the light on in the hallway, went down, made dinner, watched TV, lounging on the couch, enjoying my evening by myself. And the other half of the duplex was the home that the property owners lived in, but they were never there. They lived primarily in California. So the whole building was really just me. And they always had strange noises in their basement, I have to say. Knocking. Things were knocking in their basement constantly. And this night, I'm hearing the knocking in the basement, but I was used to it because it happened all the time. And I thought, well, maybe it's their old furnace. I was, I'm by myself, so I'm trying to use logic to stay comfortable. So here I am. I turn off the lights, time to get to bed. It's middle of the work week. And I start heading up the stairs. And again, it's a 3 story. So main floor, long staircase, and then the pillars or the posts of the railing that lined the hallway on the second floor, which led to another staircase that went up to the attic floor, which had 2 rooms plus a storage room. This is great space. I love this place. In any case, up the staircase I'm going, and I, as per habit, look to my left to look at in the hallway, looking through the pillars of the banister, and I see these little legs and feet and the hem of a dress. And I literally threw my back to the wall and I stopped and I'm staring through these pillars, following these feet and legs walking down the hallway, not out of the corner of my eye, straight on and turning my head and watching this. It's the first time ever. It was the most bizarre thing. Having said that, everyone, my children and I and their kids, always felt that there was something in the house. We all felt it, even guests, even their friends. My kids' friends would always say, "Dude, this house is weird. There's something in this house." Everyone would say this, but we never saw anything. That night, I saw that. That was not, and it would be different if I were to say, "Oh, it was a flash out of the corner of my eye." But no, I literally watched this figure walk down the hallway toward that second staircase. And I had to calm myself. I walked back downstairs. I grabbed a crystal candle holder, like I'm going to beat up a ghost, right? Like this is gonna happen. And I go back up the stairs, and I'm like, "This is ridiculous." But I had to say, I said, "Look, I know you're here. I have to go to bed because I have work tomorrow. Please don't bother me." And that's all I said. I went into my bedroom and I closed the door. I never, ever, ever was bothered. It was a little girl. It was a little girl. When I say little, maybe just by the size of the foot and the shape of the leg, it was some maybe 8, 9 years old. Maybe
Wow.
10. It's a little girl. Yeah, a little girl. And a dress. I mean, I could see the hem and the eyelet, lace part of the dress at the bottom, like the what do you call it? Anyway, slip part of the dress, whatever. And definitely older style clothes, wearing tights and little shoes. Pretty like, oh, not ballet flats, but very flat shoes
Like
like
maybe
that.
Mary Jane's or that kind
Yes,
of.
exactly. Like Mary Jane. Right.
Wow, and then you never saw anything again, like her,
Never
you
saw
never.
any Never saw her again. Could sense her all the time. In fact, I would be in the living room looking at this base of the staircase. You could see it through the hallway, and we had the parlor in the front room and then the living room behind it. And I could see from the living room where the couch was towards the front door where the staircase was, the main staircase. And it was a constant feeling of looking back at that area because that was where we all sensed somebody was standing on the stairs looking into the room. That was the feeling we had. And maybe she was, because yeah,
Isn't
that
that
was just
interesting?
yeah.
I love that in a way, and sometimes it's not that easy, but I would say it seems to me like almost 85-90% of the time when someone discovers something supernatural in their house or they see a ghost, or even for people who've talked about being kind of a magnet for ghosts. Of my
Mhm.
friend's mother used to say, "Oh, they come and they wake me up at night," and all she had to do was sit up and say, "Please, just leave me alone. Please leave
Yes.
me alone. Please don't come in here anymore." I feel like 90%, 95% of the time that seems to work.
Yes. I
So,
agree. I
have you
agree.
been in a situation where you needed to bring in something more powerful than just your asking it not?
Um, no. No, I've not had the experience where I've needed to do something in addition to make certain that they would go away. No. I did have one other little story that was kind of a weird one, where that one was more unnerving than the little girl. The little girl, I already knew something was there, so just seeing her was just affirming what we already felt. The other one it started as a dream where I was in the dream, I was in a store, And at the back of the store, it was just like a little boutique kind of a store, lots of little tchotchkes everywhere. In the back of the store, there was a one step up and a ledge, and the phone was ringing in the back of the store. And the woman at the store pointed to me and said, "Answer the phone. Answer the phone." Backstory, my daughter lived in Long Island at the time, and she said she was gonna come home for the weekend to New Jersey where I live, and she was taking the train and asked if I would pick her up from the train station. So that's the backstory, and I said, "Sure, I'll pick you up whenever you get in, just let me know." That night, I have this dream. In the dream, the owner of the store says to me, "Answer the phone." So I answer the phone and it's my daughter and she's panicked. And I could hear she's on the train and she's like, "Mom, mom." And she's crying. And I'm like, "What's going on? What's happening?" And the voice changes. And now it's a man's voice. And I hear it in my ear saying, "I died." But not only do I hear it, I can feel the breath. And this is literally what woke me up. I could feel the man's breath in my ear saying, "I died." So, of yeah, that creeped me out and it woke me up. Of course, I didn't go back to sleep right away. And then that next morning, I called her from work. I says, "Hey, listen, weirdo mom here. Please do me a favor. Let me know when you get on the train and tell me, and I'll be there at the station when you get in." She's like, "Okay." And she's laughing it off. Fine. I pick her up that afternoon or that early evening, and we're chit chatting as we're pulling out of the train station. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I did get some bad news." I was like, "What happened?" She says, "Well, a friend of mine went out last night with a bunch of friends and he got hit by a car and he died." And I said, excuse the language. I said, "Well, that explains the dream I had." And I told her what happened. I said, "But the part that wasn't the thing was I could feel his breath, and that's what was different." So it was her friend.
Wow. So it must have, in timing wise, it sounds like as if it was right as he died.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think, and I think this is true for like for many people. If you're open, we will tell stories, but the likelihood is you've had experiences where, and I think it is spirit goes to those who will listen, who will hear them. So I think because I mean he was a friend of hers, not a close friend, but he was a friend of hers. Um, that it was something where, uh, and this is how I saw it. He just knew that I would hear him if he showed up.
So that's so what you're saying is people who are willing to be open channels, if you're open, if
Yeah.
that it's likely that you will, like, or the chances are higher that somebody might come
Yes.
and
Yeah.
visit you as you're open and aware. Now,
Yeah.
do you work on being open in that particular way? Or would you call yourself just generally like intuitively open due to the work that you do?
Both. It depends on the time, if I'm both. Primarily, yes, I am generally intuitively open, but then I also work and I try to manage do I leave the door cracked a little or do I leave it open a little bit more, depending upon, you know, what's happening. If I really am looking to stay connected with spirit or guardians or angels or however you want to call them, ancestors, I may try to leave that door open wider for particular periods of time because I want to hear. But then there are times when I work hard to keep it shut. And not to sound weird, but I will get that, and I know many people get this too, just as you're falling into that sleep state, you'll get the voice sounds strange, but you'll hear people trying to get your attention. And I will wake myself up and say, "Stop. I am not here for conversation. I'm going to sleep."
Wow. So is this happening at the beginning of your sleep or later on when you wake up, like at 2, 3 a.m.?
As I'm beginning to go to sleep, as I'm relaxing, as you get to that, you get in bed, you start getting snuggled, and you're relaxing, and you're getting comfortable, and your breathing starts to slow, and then I'll start. If I pay attention, I really will start to hear trying to get my attention, and I will literally say, "Stop. I'm going to sleep."
So So for people listening, um, is your advice, do you have advice for, I guess, advice for both ways, for keeping the door open? What do you do? And for protecting yourself and putting down boundaries, what would you suggest for people who are interested in both?
I think it really does become a conscious and deliberate activity. So, am I always good at keeping things closed? No, I am not always good at managing the guardrails, if you will. And I do have to constantly work at, let's allow certain things. And again, the biggest thing I would recommend or suggest is to remind yourself that yes, you ultimately are the gatekeeper, and as you will it, you need to manifest it. If this is something you do not want to have engaging with you, you know, you make clear boundaries. No, this is the line you do not cross. And I do have the strength to say, you will not cross this. There has to be that clear understanding within self, and to know that that's something to do, and manage it. I'm not inviting whoever whatever. I don't want whoever whatever. So that is very clear. It's only those that are here for my highest good, who are of causing no harm, who are not ill intentioned. So it's very clear who you're inviting. You're not just inviting any and everything. It's like putting everything in the pot and hoping you get a good meal. It's gonna be a disaster, you know?
You want to start with ingredients that you really like.
Precisely so, precisely so. Those otherwise known as well elevated spirit or ancestor. So even if I call to my ancestors, I'm not looking for the ones who had the drama and the history of, alcohol or drug abuse, and or who have, anger issues, or who are extremely violent. I'm not looking to create bridges to those folk, because they have things that they need to address, and I don't need to take on that work personally, because it may just be disruptive for me and make just it may demand too much of me, and I don't necessarily need to take all of that on as well as my own stuff. So I look to those ancestors who are well and elevated. That's part of the language I use.
When you work with ancestors, what are the goals? In other words, for instance, something that I did recently, which I loved, because I had actually heard Maya Angelou had given this advice. And I happened to be in a situation where I was going into a big party all by myself, and I was nervous. Like, I didn't have a plus one, and I kind of needed to hold my own. I was a special guest. And I had heard Maya Angelou say, when people walk in a room and they just sparkle, what's one of the keys? You take your people with you. You never
Yes.
walk in the room alone.
That's
And I
so, so powerful.
Such great advice. So I thought, well, okay, who do I personally know who's passed over that would love this party, that would be down for this party? And I knew immediately who it was. And so I invited him to sit next to me, and like we walked into that party together. He was with me all evening. So and I think he had as good of a time, hopefully, as I did, and it was lovely it was a lovely way to share space with someone who I had a deep connection with when I was a child. So I think that's a great example of one way to work with an ancestor. Could you share an example of how you work with your ancestors? Because, like a specific example of what it means to you, some of your favorite ancestor practices.
Oh my gosh. And in in the way of honoring, here we are, we're in the season of the year where we're talking about, oh, meal preparation and spending time together and being grateful and giving thanks and all of those various things. It's the energy of the season of being with friends and family. That's the time of year we're kind of in. So, one of the ways I work with ancestors is honoring them and remembering them through in what's bringing to life or continuing to do the things and do the work that they did and loved. So if they shared something with me, for example, my mom, she loved to cook. She loved to garden. She loved to do needlework. So she sewed and she knit and she did all sorts of things like that. She did, I mean, rug hooking and weaving and all sorts of things. So honoring ancestors for me is not just like that type of work. I can engage my ancestor and say, I want to honor and remember you, and I want to continue on with that work in the present. So when I cook, I honor my mom. I honor my grandmother when I bake because she loved to bake. I honor my grandfather if I'm doing some sort of, even if it just means hanging shelves because he loved anything creative, hanging things. He could what's the word? Uh, Deconstruct to reconstruct a thing. He'll take something apart, learn how it works, and then put it back together so that he could then improve it. So if I do any of those things, I'm honoring my ancestors in that way as well. If it's the storytelling, if it's my great grandmother, for example, loved to garden. She always had a garden. Even when she was well into her 80s, she had a garden that she tended. So even when I raise my plants from seed, I'm honoring my ancestors in that way. um, when it comes to doing artistic work, I have a great cousin who was a famous singer back in the day. So we're talking 30s and 40s now. Um, so if I'm in the space of performing, I call to her and ask her, as you did with, when you walked into that party, you're calling to those who are of that world, who are comfortable in that space, who did great work or whatever, and you ask them to be with you as you do this. It's honoring them, but it's also leaning on them for their experience and yeah.
It makes life so much richer. Do you know? It is such a pleasurable thing to do, and I think that especially when people have passed, that you have such a close connection. Um, it's such a beautiful way to continue that relationship, to continue engaging in their energy and building, so there still is an expansiveness to it, because often I think when we're with people and till the end of their lives, it can feel like things become diminished because perhaps they're not doing what they used to do, and you're not doing the thing. You're not like going to the theater and out to dinner, and you're visiting them in the hospital, and they're settling into the completion of their experience in this world. So I think it is such a pleasurable thing to continue the relationship in an expansive way that then you share perhaps with your friends or your children or other members of the family, and um I love that. I love that. And it does feel like, the end of fall and especially winter. It's such a perfect time to be doing this work. And it is so easy. And I think it's so funny that people think that Halloween is the spooky holiday, when really Halloween is just kind of that time of year, is just the door kind of blowing open with the veils thinning, and it just seems to me to get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner until the solstice, until the end of the year. Nothing, I think, is spookier than the holidays, between the weightedness of just expectation of what people, and the memories, and then the food and the trauma. Trauma is an opening thing too, like the trauma and drama of the holidays and family, like, and I just
You're so right. You're so right. I am with you. And then you think about, Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, it's a ghost story. It's a ghost story. So, yeah, that whole season of being in the dark and trying to remind ourselves of the light and the returning of the light and that it will come back and we won't freeze to death and we won't die. And, but the fact that we are in it and surrounded and swaddled, if you will, in the softness of it, but then that means we get to be connected more deeply to that darkness, and we have to find our peace with it and not be afraid with it of it. That's yeah, that beauty, and who sits in the dark? Those shadows, those things that aren't easy to see. That yeah, I'm with you. I love the season for all of that. The challenge, as you said, the trauma, that all of it is inviting for me. It really is
Yeah.
inviting.
And it's spooky and it's harrowing.
It's spooky. It is.
It
It
is like a
is.
ghost story. Yeah, working with the darkness, and because if you look at, there tends to be in metaphysical communities this idea of love and light.
Yeah.
Um, but the nature of the universe is darkness, right?
Yes.
Is dark matter, and the nature of the
Yes.
universe is silence. But when you start looking into silence, you find that it's humming, it's full. And that may be why when we're children,
Mm,
we are frightened of the darkness because,
mm,
especially because we've just come from that other world when we're little kids. So we know there are things perhaps not manifest yet in this
yeah.
world. I don't know that may be why as children and even as adults we can be scared of a dark house and what might be hiding in the darkness, because I do think that yeah, it is a very rich, full, humming thing, humming place. Um, so I want to ask you, based on your experience, what do you think? And there's no right or wrong answer to this, but where do you think you were before you were born, and where do
Mhm.
you think you'll go when you pass on to the next? What are your
Next
ideas?
journey. That is such a great question, and we can go off onto all sorts of beautiful tangents and in all different directions. Where was I before? And that I have and I have spent time trying to trying to recall my earliest memory, the moment where I recognized, oh, the I am moment. And I can
Mhm.
remember back to things that I did when I was very, very young, but I was still maybe 4 years old. Yeah, about 4 years old. That's probably my earliest memory, the I am moment. And before that, I still have that question of how is it I was able to function from infancy to that I am moment and to this point right now not have conscious memory. And I think it's because we are so close to being still connected to where we were before we embodied and came into the world. And so we're split. Our attentions are split. The same
Mhm.
way our attentions are split between awake being awake, consciously awake and aware, and being in a dream state or sleeping. There is a split because sometimes we remember our dreams and other times we don't. But things are still happening. So I think of it in that space. Why is it we're consciously aware and why do we not have memory? Where was I before? I feel that spirit was doing what spirit does. For example, and here's me going off on another tangent. My mom passed away 8 years ago now. Yes. My aunt, my godmother, my aunt and my mother were very close friends. My aunt passed away about 5 years ago now. When my aunt passed, I would have these quote unquote dreams of my mother. I call them visitations because the feeling was very different. But in any case, there was a dream I had, I'll use that language, where my daughter came to me and said, "Mom, grandma is upstairs. Go see her." So I go up the stairs. I turn the corner. There she is. It's her spirit. And she's about to leave because it took her a lot of energy just to manifest so I could see her. And I said, "Hey, have you seen Aunt Lenora?" Because my aunt had recently died. And she said to me, "I haven't seen her, but I can hear her." And then the image shifted, and there were like all these different layers. So my mother was saying, my mother, who had died several years prior, was further away from the physical world. My aunt was still closely attached to the physical world. My mother could hear her in the spirit realm, but couldn't see her yet because my aunt was still too closely tied to the physical. That was an energy, and that feeling or that explanation is how I see what spirit is like before we come into the physical. We are so in the ether, out in the spiritual realm, in some level of consciousness, I don't know. And then we are embodied with this particular awareness, and I'm Rhonda today. And now I'm here, and now I'm getting further and further away from spirit because I'm in the physical world. And oh, then I'm 4 years old and I have the awareness of, oh, I am. I know that's a long story, but I hope that makes sense.
Well,
I hope that
I
makes
think
sense.
first of all, it perfectly makes sense. And like, once again, we're talking about things that are very hard to put words around.
Yeah.
And and so it wasn't a long story. I think that it actually it it makes me think of the Tibetan Buddhist Bardo,
Mm, yeah.
space with which I think it's like 49 days with which a dead soul is like moving before it reincarnates or or moves on to nirvana.
Yes.
Um, so it makes perfect sense to me. And again, we're talking about an inclination. Like, we can only know
Yeah.
what we know or what we sense. There is, we only know what our experiences are. So do you think that after we leave
Hmm.
um this life, do you think we return, sort of so the same thing is true moving in and then moving, and then the entrance and the exit
Yeah.
is probably the same.
It's probably the same. And then it becomes a question of, you know, is and because I do believe spirit is the eternal constant. Soul is the individual personality, if you will. So Rhonda's soul will be Rhonda's soul, but that Rhonda's soul is part of my ultimate spirit. Okay. So there's a distinction I'm putting in. Having said that, we're all part of the same. So if I were to come back into physical being, it'll be another piece of my spirit in another physical embodiment, which will have its own little soul piece. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yes.
so, so yeah, I could see that that happening again and again and again, um, until it no longer is necessary to happen.
So interesting. And I have to ask you, just
Mm.
because we're talking about, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about small children and their relationship to wherever they have come from. I've had a lot of wonderful stories around the fire about things that people's children have done that have been kind of spooky and odd and interesting. Did your children ever do anything that made you go, "Oh my goodness"? Like, did
Yeah.
they?
Yes, they have. Primarily my son. My daughter doesn't speak of it much. I have my children are twins. My daughter is 10 minutes older than my son. Having said that, I remember when they were about 3. They were about 3 years old, and we were visiting their grandmother, we were visiting my mom, and we had the big living room as our room. It had huge pocket doors, so we had a couple of beds and pull-out couch. We were all in there, so me and the kids. And one morning, my son um, asked me, "Hey, mom, who was that lady who came in last night?" And I said, "What lady?" And he says, "The one in the polka dot dress." And I have no idea who he was speaking about. Now, my mother lived in a very rural area of town and on a small mountain. It's New Jersey, so there aren't big mountains, but she lived on a mountain on a dirt road. It's very rural, no street lights, unpaved. It's, you're in the woods. It's very dark at night. So there's nothing, there's no one who's sneaking in and visiting. So I have no idea but he remembers seeing her. And to this day, my kids are 34 now. He remembers seeing a woman at the door of our room in a polka dot dress watching us sleep. And I have no idea. Um, um, my daughter hasn't told me any stories similar to that, but yeah, I mean, that's probably it. They haven't spoken. They never mentioned, oh, who I was before I was who I am now. They haven't had stories like that. But that one from Nick does stand out. Yeah.
Love that. I love that. Oh, wouldn't it be interesting if we could just spend a few hours like reviewing our consciousness from when we were like 2 and 3 years old, to go back and just see what was happening. I think that it's so curious. It's just so interesting.
I am with you. I wish I could. Hey, there are people who do what hypnotics or hypnotic, yes, past. So maybe that's the answer. I don't know. I think that's a really curious thing. I'd love to try that.
Yeah, but at the same time, I also am a believer if my psyche has kind of closed something off, maybe it needs to stay there as well.
There's truth to that. There are reasons why we don't know as much as, yeah. So that is very true.
Rhonda, thank you so much for being a guest, for sharing your stories and your experiences with us. It's just been wonderful.
It's been so much fun. Thank you for having me. And I am really excited to hear more. These are good stories. So thank you for inviting me to be around the fire. I
This
love
is
it.
the stuff that makes life worth living. I think
Yes.
it's love it. I love it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of Ghost Stories by the Fire. Do you have a spooky story, near death experience, or supernatural happening you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Submit your story to sashagraham.com with Ghost Stories by the Fire in the subject line. You might just wind up on this podcast. And if you want to support it and keep the ghost stories coming, head on over to sashagraham.com to check out my books and tarot decks, which are available for purchase at your favorite bookseller. The Ghost Stories by the Fire theme song is titled Lovely, from the original motion picture score of The Deeper You Dig, a film about the lengths a mother will go to find her daughter's killer. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, I'm saving you a seat at the fire.